Hello, hello, lovely to have you here. What I want to discuss today is about pleasure in early Buddhism, a really important topic that I don't think I've dealt with in any of my prior videos in the depth that it requires. In my last video, if you've seen it, I discussed the idea of a hierarchy of pleasures in a couple of Western thinkers, in particular Epicurus from ancient Greece and John Stuart Mill from the 19th century England. And if you're interested in that video, I'll leave a link to it down below in the notes. In this video, I want to turn to Buddhism, in particular early Buddhism, and look at that idea of a hierarchy of pleasures in early Buddhism as well. Now, those of you who've seen that earlier video of mine will know that this idea of a hierarchy of pleasures in the Western tradition was partly elaborated in order to help foundationalize the ethical systems of both Epicurus on the one hand and John Stuart Mill on the other. By foundationalize, I mean give a firm grounding somewhere of the ethical claims that are made in the theories, the philosophies of these two thinkers. In the West, this kind of foundationalism was seen in many philosophies as being critical. You have to find the foundations of it somewhere that you can anchor it down to something else, something that perhaps goes above and beyond our ordinary intuitions and so can prove why I'm right and you're wrong, let's say. Now, I'll turn to that issue with regard to Buddhism at the end of this video. So in any event, the Buddha also described a hierarchy of pleasures within the Dharma. Now, a side note, the word for pleasure here, the Pali word, is Sukha. That's the one that's most often used in these contexts. Sukha is the opposite of dukkha. Dukkha is the word we'll encounter in the First Noble Truth, which is often translated as suffering. And so if dukkha is suffering, the opposite of suffering, we might say, is pleasure. However, there are many ways of translating the word sukha into English. Sometimes it's translated pleasure, sometimes happiness, sometimes bliss, and so on and so forth. There are many ways of translating it. That becomes a kind of a rabbit hole that I don't want to get down. We'll just assume for most of these cases that pleasure is the correct translation here, with the understanding that it is a somewhat amorphous term that can have a lot of similar kinds of meanings. So in any event, this idea of a hierarchy of pleasures in early Buddhism isn't simply that some pleasures are greater than others. That's uncontroversial. That's not something that's a surprise to any of us. We know that some foods taste better than others, that some smells smell better than others. That's not the issue. It's rather that some pleasures are greater than others in a moral, maybe we want to say, in some sense, it's sort of a moral or a spiritual sense, for want of a better term. And so some pleasures are more worthy of our searching them out than other ones. So to begin with, in early Buddhism, there are 5 or 6, depending on the sutta, kinds of sense pleasure. That is, there are pleasures associated with each of our senses. That is, there are visual pleasures having to do with the eye, auditory pleasures, let's say beautiful music, having to do with the ear, nice smells, nice tastes, nice touches. And the 6th one would be mental pleasures, ideas, thoughts that we find pleasurable. Again, in certain suttas it's described as 5, in other ones it's described as 6. That it's not really a distinction that needs to hold us up, except that it does provide some difference between the way the Buddha looked at this and the way some Western thinkers looked at it. In any event, these 5 or 6 are considered the lowest forms of pleasure for the Buddha. They're pleasures that we share with other non-human animals, for example. And I think we all know about these pleasures. They're very intense, they're very grabbing, but they're also problematic in certain respects. And what the Buddha has to say about them is actually quite strong. Now, I'm going to cite here a short sentence from the Buddha. We have to remember that this would have been said to monastics, people who were professional practitioners. and not to a sort of a general lay audience, but in any event, this is what he had to say. He said that these kinds of sense pleasure are filthy, ordinary, ignoble pleasure. Such pleasure should not be cultivated or developed, but should be feared, I say. Now, this is a pretty strong statement here. We might think, okay, these pleasures are motivating, they're intense, but really are they to be feared? That seems pretty strong. And that they're filthy and all the rest. They're sort of morally suspect is basically what he's saying. Why is he saying that they're to be feared? I mean, it's the fact that that we should fear them that makes them morally suspect. Well, the reason that they're to be feared is that these kinds of pleasures often are bound up in, let's say, physical things that we can possess, that we can own. They're bound up in beautiful objects that we might buy, in music that we might pay for, in food that we might obtain or drink. And how do we obtain these things? Well, we obtain them by gaining wealth. We obtain them by gaining power, by gaining fame. It's our being famous, it's our being powerful and wealthy and beloved of others that gains us entrance to these kinds of pleasures. So, for example, if we're looking for the true life of physical pleasure, we're going to want to have a lot of money. As much money as we can gain, frankly. We're going to want to have a lot of power and pull, fame with other people. And the problem is that when what we're after are these worldly aims of wealth and fame and power, we're liable to fall into ethical problems. The typical reason why people do things wrong in life is out of pursuit for these very kinds of pleasure. In other words, they lead to things such as theft and murder and sexual misconduct, lying, and so on. That's the reason why people act improperly in the world, is in order to obtain the wealth and fame and fortune and all the rest that will allow them to possess the things that give them sense pleasures. And in one early sutta, the Buddha goes into this long, we might term a parade of horribles, where he describes all the awful things that have happened in the world, up to and including warfare between cultures and societies, between kings looking for more wealth and power and all the rest, that kill uncounted numbers of people, that are at the end the problem, the fearful problem with these kinds of sense pleasures. So while these kinds of sense pleasures are indeed agreeable and pleasant, the Buddha doesn't deny that, they're also extremely dangerous for these very reasons. And perhaps the basic, deepest reason that they're dangerous is that these pleasures condition craving. They condition hatred in certain respects. They make us want more of them. There's no limit to how much of them we could want. And the more that we want, the more that we want to get. And the more that we get, the less we want to give them up. And so this becomes a kind of a spiral, or it can, in any event, become a kind of a spiral that leads us in the direction of things that are not to our benefit in the long run. But, importantly, critically, for the Buddha, there are higher pleasures than these sense pleasures. And there are a couple of early suttas, at least, that describe this hierarchy, one that's stated by the Buddha, and another where Sariputta, the Buddha's right-hand disciple and the leader in wisdom of his disciples, also says something very similar. They both describe this kind of hierarchy of pleasures. And in particular, in this sutta, Sariputta discusses how when you're in a deep state of meditative absorption, in particular what's called the first jhana, which is the first of many of these states of deep absorption, from that state, these sense pleasures that I've been describing appear as afflictions. Each one appears as an affliction to us. Now, these jhanas, in particular the first three, I'll get to the fourth in a minute, there are 4 jhanas, they're typified by pleasure. They're particular, again, states of meditative absorption that are described as being pleasurable. That's what defines them in a sense. Now, I've done videos on all of these. I'll leave a link to a playlist down below if you don't know about them. But in any event, that's what you need to know for this video. And so they're pleasurable to such a degree that when we look back, when we consider sense pleasures in relation to them, the sense pleasures don't seem pleasurable. In the same way, let's say that when you try one meal and think it tastes good, but you try a different one in a really good restaurant, you think, wow, that is so good that previous thing that I thought I liked, that doesn't seem good anymore. You know, you can think of, you get a fast food a meal that you think is delicious, but then you get a meal in a good restaurant and you think, I was just wrong about that fast food meal that I had. It really wasn't that delicious. The same thing happens here, at least according to Sariputta. Now, it's not only that these jhanas are more pleasurable than ordinary sense pleasures, but as I say, they're also more ethically or spiritually pure than sense pleasures. Now, how is that the case? In order to understand how that's the case, we can look back at the Buddha's own life and his own search for enlightenment. And we may recall that during a period of time, the Buddha was searching around. In particular, he spent a number of years, or at least a long time, undertaking a number of deep, painful, ascetic practices of one kind and another, thinking that these ascetic practices, these pains that he would undergo, would sort of burn the desire for pleasure out of him, or burn whatever moral problems there were with pleasure out of him, and lead him directly to enlightenment. However, he found that that was not the case. He found that these deep states of pain that he was undergoing were not really leading him in the right direction. And it was at that point that he remembered having attained the first jhana that I just mentioned, this state of pleasurable, intense meditation. He recalled having attained it as a boy. And he realized, for whatever reason, he claims that he realized at that point that it was the jhanas that were the route to enlightenment, not these painful ascetic practices. And how did he realize that? Well, one of the things that seems to have made him realize, at least that's what he discusses in these early suttas, is that while it's true that he feared sense pleasure, he didn't fear jhanic pleasure. He says, "I'm not afraid of that pleasure, for it has nothing to do with sensual pleasures or unskillful qualities." Nothing to do with sense pleasures or unskillful qualities. Well, clearly the jhanic pleasure is not itself a sense pleasure, that's obvious. But the reason it doesn't have anything to do with unskillful qualities, at least in the Buddha's telling here, is that in order to attain that first jhana, we have to overcome what are called the mental hindrances. In particular, these unskillful states of greed, sensual greed or desire, of a monkey mind, of sleepiness, and of doubt, and a number of others in other suttas as well that I've gone through in some of my past videos. In any event, the point is that the mind has to be cleared of all of these unskillful mental states, at least for a period of time, in order to achieve this first jhana. And so therefore, it's not a state in which the mind is polluted by any kind of impurities, at least in the Buddha's understanding. Now, once we get into this first jhana, the Buddha goes on to describe, there are a number of other states that also follow, as I've said, the second jhana, the third jhana, and so on. What happens here, the Buddha says, is that, well, I should say Sariputta says, but this is following the Buddha's own paradigm here, that, as we've said, from the first jhana, the sense pleasures seem like afflictions. However, as we stay in that first jhana and it deepens and becomes more profound and quiet, more peaceful, we reach what's called the second jhana. And for Sariputta, when we get to the second jhana, the activity, the mental activity that we've had in the first jhana itself seems an affliction. And so on to the third jhana. That is to say, as we get to these deeper and more profound states of mental absorption, of meditation, previous states seem afflictions to us. They don't seem that they were pleasurable in comparison to the state that we have now. And finally, we get to the fourth jhana, which is a state that's actually defined as one in which both pleasure and pain have been left completely behind. Now, this is very surprising because the Buddha actually describes the fourth jhana as a state more pleasurable than anything that's come before it. And this apparent contradiction, this apparent paradox, is something of a conundrum for us. That this deep, deep, deep state of meditative absorption is both beyond pleasure and pain, and at the same time the most pleasurable thing that we have experienced until now. Now, the scholar Peat, in one of his papers, looks at a commentary to this particular passage where the Buddha says this. And in the commentary, it's described basically that this state is so sublime and peaceful that it can accurately be called pleasurable, even though it doesn't have any real pleasure associated with it. That is, it would seem there are refined states of mental absorption, of meditative absorption that are so peaceful and so ethically pure that they go beyond our ordinary understanding of the word pleasure. We might say that we get to them by taking the perception of pleasure and sort of refining off all of the rough edges of that pleasure until only the peace remains. But that peace itself is, from an ethical perspective, even more pleasurable than the pleasures that came before it. And then, if we want to continue along this route, we can actually go from the fourth jhana into what are known as the formless attainments, which I also described in prior videos. I'm not going to go into them in detail here. But in any event, Sariputta says that we leave behind any perceptions of form when we go into the formless attainments. And from the point of view of each of those attainments, the attainments of the jhanas themselves appear as afflictions. They're too rough, they're too in your face compared to the subtle kinds of peace in the formless attainments. So what we see here is again, a hierarchy of pleasures that goes beyond our ordinary pleasures into states of peace that are considered more and more and more pleasurable. And this goes all the way until we get to nirvana itself. And the Buddha famously says in the Dhammapada that nirvana is the ultimate happiness, or we might translate that same sentence as nirvana is the ultimate pleasure. It's the same word sukha in both cases, it's just how we translate the word. Now the question is, how can nirvana be this ultimate bliss, ultimate happiness, ultimate pleasure, when nirvana is not an experience of anything at all? And indeed, in one early sutta, Sariputta says nirvana is pleasurable. And when he says that, he's actually asked this very question about how can nirvana be pleasurable? And it's this kind of back and forth between Sariputta and one of his disciples that really spurred on my interest in making this video. What goes on in that discussion is this. I'll cite the discussion for you. It says, when Sariputta said this, that nirvana is pleasurable, Venerable Udayi said to him, "But Reverend Sariputta, what is pleasurable about it, since nothing is felt? The fact that nothing is felt is precisely what's pleasurable about it." Now this brings us around to some interesting contrasts between the ideas of pleasure that we find in early Buddhism and those that we found in that I discussed in the prior video in these Western thinkers of Epicurus and John Stuart Mill. In the Western tradition, pleasure is more associated with intellectual or rational or reasoned thought. Now that's more true of Mill than it is of Epicurus, because for Epicurus, the greatest pleasure was this kind of ataraxy, which was this kind of bliss, or I should say peaceful bliss. But nevertheless, I think intellectual thought is closer to the apex there of pleasure for them than it is for the Buddha. So while it's true, I'm sure, that the Buddha would have said that, let's say, the intellectual pleasures of discussing the Dharma and reasoning about the Dharma, investigating the Dharma, would have been higher unworldly pleasures that would have trumped any sense pleasures we might have. They would be higher pleasures. Nevertheless, this doesn't come up in any of his hierarchies of the pleasures that we find, at least that I know of, in the early suttas. Instead, what we find in the early suttas, as I've said, as I've shown here, is a discussion of a hierarchy of pleasures where sense pleasures are the lowest and the pleasures of deep meditative absorption are higher. And in the European intellectual tradition, there was no similar awareness of these kinds of states of deep meditative absorption. While meditation was mentioned in the West, it was really intended more closely related to intellectual thought and meditation in that sense than it was to deep absorption on a particular, let's say, meditative object that we find in Buddhism. Secondly, and perhaps relatedly, as I mentioned in the last video, for many Western thinkers, Mill being one of them, these intellectual pleasures are typified by discontent. They're spurred on by intellectual curiosity, let's say, this kind of roving mind. And that's quite different from the idea of the highest kinds of pleasure that we find in Buddhism, or for that matter in Epicurus as well. So intellectual pursuits of, let's say, investigating the Dharma would have been very important for the Buddha and very laudable. They didn't typify the highest forms of pleasure for him. Now, to say a word about foundationalism in ethics. As I've said before, part of the reason for looking at these kinds of hierarchies of the pleasures in the Western tradition was to foundationalize their ethics, to look for some tangible evidence in the world that could ground our ethical intuitions in something that was more easily seen than our intuitions themselves. So, for example, we might say, doing one thing is better than another. Somebody might disagree with us, but if we can point to the fact that, okay, doing that first thing creates more pleasure and reduces more pain, well, that's a justification. That's kind of a grounding of that intuition of ours that might help us, let's say, win the right arguments because we're grounding the thing in the right way. That was extremely important in the Western intellectual philosophical tradition. However, the Buddha himself never had a real interest in foundationalizing the Dharma. He was never interested in looking at a foundation for ethics, for example. So we may ask of the Buddha, is ethics really about pleasures and pains, increasing pleasure, decreasing pain, as we might think from what I've said in today's video, right? Increasing pleasures all the way to nirvana, decreasing pains, decreasing suffering. We might think. Or is it about coming up with formulas for the right thing to do? Or, alternately, is it about increasing our virtues, making ourselves virtuous in certain respects, and maximizing our virtuous capacities? These are three different ways that ethics has been foundationalized in the Western tradition. And while there are certain ways of looking at early Buddhism that are, to me, better than others, that is to say, capture more of what the Buddha said better than others, there's no final answer as to which of these or what other way we can foundationalize the Buddha's ethics, because the Buddha never described anything in that way. And so we'd simply be putting an outside a template on the Buddha's ideas in a way that wouldn't really capture them properly. And to that end, I did an earlier video about the Buddha's pragmatism, using as an example his simile of the handful of leaves to get at the kind of pragmatic viewpoint that he had towards ethics and philosophy generally. So if you want to see that, I'll leave a link to it up here on the screen. Meanwhile, if you're getting something out of these videos of mine, consider taking a look over at my Patreon page, which is linked down below, and see if you want to help support the channel and get some fun things in return for that support, which you'll find at that link. Thanks so much for watching, and we'll catch you on the next video. And meanwhile, all of you, be well.